Well, good evening and welcome. I am very honored to be here. This has been an amazing day, chock full of really cool information. It's been a pretty long day, and a colleague of mine recommended that, it's been a long day, everybody's kind of saturated with information. He said I should start with a joke, but I don't know any jokes, but I do have something slightly funny, I think, anyway. So I'll just start with that. All these AAS acronyms we have, as a service, like database as a service, and email as a service, and HR as a service, et cetera, et cetera. What do you suppose is the funniest AAS acronym? That's a good one. Sadness as a service. I believe that the funniest as a service acronym is human resources as a service. And why is that? Well, pronounce it out. Okay, so that's exactly what HR is not supposed to do to us. So anyway, that concludes the humor for the evening. My name's John Wetherill. I'm developer, Paas Evangelist at ActiveState. And just to qualify myself, my entire career has been in software development at a variety of companies. And I've found myself drawn towards processes and tools and ways to improve the development experience. And I was very naturally drawn towards platform as a service. A couple of years ago when I discovered it, it just knocked me off my chair. So I called up ActiveState, asked if they had any developer jobs open. They didn't, but they have this evangelist role, so I jumped on board. And then based on something Brian was saying this morning, my very first program I wrote decades ago for money, the first program I wrote for money was a virtual machine for the IBM 360. And I remember they paid me $1 per line of code back then, not including comments, obviously. And I remember I got $4,000 for this program, so you could do the math and figure out how many lines of code it was. So anyway, I've been very enthused about virtualization ever since, and it's been a natural progression. So I work for ActiveState. We're out of Vancouver in Canada. We've been around for a long time, for I think 17 years. And we've built language packs for Python and Perl and Tickle and a bunch of other things. We have an IDE called Komodo, which is really good for dynamic languages, any dynamic language. And more recently, we've totally dove into the platform as a service, the Paas world, with our product called Staccato. I'll say a little bit more about that later. First of all, I want to talk about a very pinnacle moment a couple of years ago at PyCon 2013 in Santa Clara. I was sitting out in the audience. I'm not a Python developer, never have been. I appreciate the language, but I was out in the audience watching the keynotes and the lightning talks, and there was lightning talk about code coverage tools for Python. And then somebody came up and showed Christmas light controls using Python. And I was sitting back there kind of yawning my head off. And then suddenly this fellow hopped on stage and presented a 5-minute talk that just blew my mind and pretty much everybody else in the room. I don't know how many people saw the talk. This is obviously when he unveiled Docker, when Solomon Hykes unveiled Docker. And I remember the facilitator, it was a 5-minute talk, and he was strict. And 5 minutes and 1 second after Solomon started, he got the hook. The guy said, "Okay, you're done. And I heard all these people in the audience just gasped, no, because it was so cool. So anyway, and it's a very cool talk. I could swear that after it was over, I saw all these Google engineers race out of the hallway to payphones to inform the mothership of this really cool technology. Okay, I'm totally joking. And that evening, there was emails circulating around our development team, just this really cool thing that we have to check out. So I go to a ton of conferences. It's pretty much part of my job. And I started to pay attention. I asked attendees, have you heard of Docker? Have you seen this really cool thing called Docker? And for months, I didn't hear a thing about it. Just nobody mentioned it. No one asked about it. And then suddenly on June 21st, 2013, I wrote it in my calendar, somebody approached where we were speaking and said, "Hey, have you guys ever heard of this thing called Docker?" And that was the very first mention. So then fast forward 1 year later, Docker everywhere. And I totally pay attention to this. Every conference I go to, I say to myself, when's the first mention of Docker going to be? And now it's to the point where it's almost impossible to go to a conference and not hear this word, a technology, a cloud conference, and not hear this mention of this thing called Docker. As I'm sure you've all been very aware of. So it's interesting. Any technology that's going to go through a cycle like this, it's going to have this hype cycle at the beginning, the peak of inflated expectations, and then after that, it's going to dive. And what I've noticed and observed, I talked to a lot of people about Docker, is that there's a fair amount of hostility towards it these days. And it's actually surprising the degree of venom that I hear directed at Docker. I hear it all over the place, and it slightly hurts because I feel very warm and friendly towards the technology itself. So I like to find out why it is. What's the cause of all this hostility? What are the reasons? And I take notes, and what I've discovered is kind of falls into 4 categories. The first is that Docker, it's got all this hype and everybody's excited about it, but it's not really new. And as Tim mentioned in the Google talk earlier, they've been using containerization since 2006. And containerization has been around with Solaris zones and BSD jails. So really, Docker, what is it actually providing? Is the sentiment. And sure, that's a point. Docker, however, makes it much more reachable to the masses and much easier, and you don't have to muck around with LXC APIs. And no matter what, new or not, that's not a reason to be so vicious towards it, right? Another sentiment I keep hearing is Docker is not ready. So meaning it's not production ready for apps that you've got in your enterprise. And that actually is true to some extent, or it has been. It's getting more and more ready. There's still a couple of issues which I'll address shortly. A third sentiment I hear is Docker is not enough, which I'll be talking about through the remainder of this presentation. And then the fourth sentiment that was mentioned earlier this morning is that Docker, there's some things that are really hard still with Docker. But again, it's not Docker's fault that distributed computing is hard. It's not Docker's fault. It just is the case. Docker makes a lot of other things easier. So all this venom towards Docker, I personally believe it's a little bit misguided. Then I don't know if I should put this quote up. I hope Josh isn't here. I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and sort of colleague of mine in my industry said this quote: "Containers on bare metal is like having unprotected sex with the internet." I'm not sure I can qualify or comment on this because I've never actually had unprotected sex with the internet. But at any rate, he makes a good point. And here's the point, is running containers on bare metal without having some sort of isolation with VMs it can be a little bit risky in that if something happens in one container, like it gets out of control or it allows access to memory on the host or in another container, that's a really bad thing. So a lot of people like to run containers on VMs. In spite of what Brian said early this morning at the first talk today, there is reasons to isolate containers on VMs. So anyway, so I just wanted to start off with some of the discussion of some of the hostility towards this thing. But I'm not, as you maybe can tell by now, I have no hostility towards it. I love Docker and I'm a big fan of it. However, love it or not, whoops, wrong way. It's still not enough. And I think much of this will be obvious to people in the room, so I'll run through it relatively quickly. So Docker is very handy. There's no question about that. It makes it just easy to manage LXC containers and package up isolated applications to replicate them multiple times. Very handy. However, it's just a container technology. There's so much more that's needed to build reliable, available, secure, scalable enterprise applications today over and above the container themselves. And that would be things like things to provision and orchestrate and manage and scale and secure these containers, all these things. So I have all these images that I got from a slide deck from my CEO, which I kind of like. So anyway, so you need things like to lift them and transport them and lift them and transport them. Sorry. Okay. The bottom line is really the whole point here is from a software organization, an enterprise that's building software, which, by the way, is every enterprise these days. Whether you make toothpaste or tires or you're a restaurant, no matter what you do today, you are an IT company, right? And that's coming even more of the case. Look at Uber with their taxi service or their ride service and how they're disrupting the regular taxi industry. You need to have a very strong IT presence today to survive. And so really, an enterprise, in order to survive, it needs certain things. And it needs basically the freedom to choose and create and innovate, okay? And those are the important things for successful delivery of software. It's not about the implementation details. It's not about the weeds, the nuts and the bolts. And that's basically what today's theme has been at this conference. It's basically the same thing. Containerization is awesome. It's revolutionary. But here are all these other things we need to actually make it work. And I like to step back and kind of look at this quote. This is on the GigaOM website, which recently got shut down, but the quote still applies. We believe the simpler path for the new stack, the new revolution of software delivery, is to give power to developers to write modern data center scale applications against an aggregation of all the resources in a data center. Okay, what's that really mean? Is that as a developer, I don't want to care about this VM or that VM or this network or just all these little details. As a development team or an industry and enterprise pushing out software, I really should not have to worry about that stuff. What I should worry about is getting my application out the door, making sure that it scales, making sure that it's available, making sure that it's secure, those kind of things. We're kind of jumping up the layer here. So most enterprises today, here's an example. I was recently talking to a very famous company that you have probably done business with. That I talked to the IT guy there, and he told me that they still have Windows XP boxes under their point-of-sale devices in every of their retail locations, and every day this XP box connects back to the back end via a modem and transfers the day's transactions over a modem in 2015, right? And believe it or not, that's what the majority of enterprises, the older enterprises, are looking like still, using this obsolete ancient technology. And obviously that is and has to change and is changing. But what my point here is that these kind of enterprises don't have the resources or the motivation or the people on board that are like people at this conference here, which everybody's very leading edge and on top of this. They're in their old ways, and they are not equipped or able to dive into all these details that we're talking about today. So that's kind of the point. So having said all that, just check my time. I'm now going to dive into some things that as an enterprise delivering software, this enterprise would need to understand and know about. And I'll run through these relatively quickly. Again, I've got some really nice images to go along with these. So logging. So anybody that's worked with logging. Okay, back in the old days, I'm talking the really old days, decades ago, logging was easy, right? On a Linux box, you have an application that sends out logs. You get to use all these cool tools like grep and awk and perl and sed and all this stuff to go through your logs and generate stuff, okay? That was back in the really old days. And then suddenly, it got a little bit more difficult when we had client-server. That means we've got logs here and we've got logs here. And then as things got more and more complex, we've got logs all over our system. If we have to capture and collect all these things, make sure they're all running, make sure that there's agents everywhere, make sure the agents don't crash, make sure the disks don't get full. And this only gets more and more complex as we are moving into the cloud. And now I've got these ephemeral services that are starting and stopping all over my network, who knows where they are. I have to make sure that the logs for these are captured. And then we have to deal with things like correlation between logs. The logs at the database, how do they correlate with something that happens at the front end or happens in the middle tier or even more interestingly, across 600 microservices that comprise my whole application. Logging is getting more and more of a pain in the butt. And yet, a developer really shouldn't spend any time writing logging stuff. Now, I'm sure most people in this room, and I certainly have, spent way too much time writing logging systems and make sure they keep running. But that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. That's not what I'm being paid to do effectively. I'm supposed to be shipping software, not writing log services, right? Okay, so next point, scaling. Scaling of applications is very important. So the typical pattern, what happens almost all the time, is let's say a startup has this cool idea for an app, they get it, they start building it, prototyping it, and getting investment, and then it's like 3 months before ship date, and someone says, you know what, we really should make sure this thing scales. And then they start, trying to do some scale testing, and then things start breaking, and then they have to re-architect, go back to the drawing board, and it's not the right approach. An application should be, and by application I also mean a service, microservice, whatever. You should be scaling your application from the very first second you write a line of code. In other words, if you start off your app, as you maybe should, with Hello World, a little panel that shows Hello World with a button on it, and that's the whole application. Just make sure the stack works. You should then, 10 seconds after that's deployed, is scale that up to 10 million users, okay? Do that from the very, very first start of everything. Most people don't today do this because they want to get that app going. They've got all these cool ideas they want to implement. But the better approach is start scaling it from day one, and then as you are evolving your application, you have scale testing going on all the time, like through the whole delivery pipeline, to make sure that in every moment it can support these 10 million users. And so I'll get in a little bit where we're going with this. Another thing I'll mention, and this is particularly relevant to microservices, is you want to have the ability to roll back and version your applications or your services. So with microservices, it's very common to have multiple versions of your services running at one time, or if not that, then the ability to roll back and forward these versions as things change or as you discover issues. And as you can imagine, writing all of this stuff yourself, I mean, you've got Docker, it's awesome, you've got these containers and everything, but still, to actually manage the versioning and rolling back and zero downtime rollbacks or roll forwards, things like that, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of knowledge and expertise. Next one, I don't know who chose these images. The on-demand self-service. This is one of the promises of cloud computing, right? There's several, but on-demand self-service is a very important one. Ideally, a developer should be able to get access to all the resources that are needed without having to submit a service desk ticket. And it continually amazes me. When I first started working on this, I was discovering these companies that would tell me that it takes, a month to get a VM provisioned, or 2 months, and I was going, what? That's crazy. And I'm used to 2 weeks, okay, back where I was. And then I recently came across a company in the financial industry where they say it takes 6 months to get a VM provisioned. 120 tickets have to be processed by their IT department before they can get a VM up, which I still baffles me. And that's obviously the wrong approach, right? So you want to enable on-demand self-service as much as you possibly can. And so, again, Docker is great for all these things, but you need another layer on top of that to enable all this stuff. Another one that's important is monitoring. I did a webinar with a couple of people talking about continuous delivery, including David Farley, who wrote the book on continuous delivery. He says that the whole concept of continuous delivery is like the experimental method, the scientific method. In other words, scientific method, it requires that in order to be meaningful, it has to be measured. And it's the same with software. If you can measure it, you can go a long way towards making it reliable or scalable and all these other things you're concerned about. But wiring up monitoring to your applications takes a fair amount of work, and making sure it's reliable and accurate and everything. So the thing is, if we just step back a bit, what I'm trying to say is oftentimes we're in the weeds. We're dealing with the plumbing. We're working with all this stuff that is not directly applicable to me building software, which is what they're paying me to do, and what really this company that makes toothpaste is supposed to be doing, not spending all their time in the weeds. And there's a lot of weeds, so I've mentioned a few of them. I'll just run through a few more while we're here. Excuse me. So some of these cloud things: elastic scaling, resource scaling, integration with the infrastructure, right? Like OpenStack or whatever you're looking at here. The ability to handle configuration of all these clusters of nodes. High availability, a very challenging and difficult problem. Security issues like single sign-on. I've got a minute. Another story is a friend of mine works at a large enterprise. He's a really smart developer. And he was tasked with the job of implementing single sign-on for his application suite, for his team. And he spent 3 months researching, okay, do I use this, do I use that, whatever. Finally, he decided, okay, I'll use Spring Security. And he got this thing, after 3 months, he got it mostly working, but there are still bugs in it. And he's not a security expert by any means, but he ended up spending 3 months of his time basically replicating the work of all the other gazillions of software developers doing the exact same thing. So more here, multi-tenancy and isolation, very important concepts. And there are some limitations with Docker that cause problems with multi-tenancy. So having multiple containers running on a single host, excuse me, if whoever owns container A doesn't trust whoever owns container B, then really they shouldn't be running on the same host. There should be another layer of isolation. I don't have time to get into that. I'm down to 3 minutes here. I'll just run through the rest. There's monitoring, as I mentioned, logging. There's routing and load balancing and service provisioning and service discovery, as was mentioned earlier. A lot of network issues mentioned earlier this morning. Rollback provisioning, service naming, polyglot language support, on and on and on. Okay, so you can build all this stuff using containerization, no problem. You can do it, but why? Why do it when you can... Okay, this is where it's going to sound like a sales pitch, but it's really not. This is about Paas, okay? Why build it when you can just use one for free? And I'll continue with, I've talked to a lot of companies, and they go through these standard phases with Paas. And the phases are like the agony of trying to build software, get it out the door. Then they discover Paas, wow, this is cool. And then, oh, I really want it, desire. And then resistance from management. It's like, no, you got to get your software out the door. And then they say, well, we've been building Paas-like stuff for years. So they start constructing their own Paas. And then they realize after doing this for months and months and months, or maybe years, that they're really spending more time writing their own Paas than they are building their own software. So the next phase is abandonment. And then finally, the final stage is they go, well, why don't we just get someone else's Paas? So that's kind of where I come in. So I do want to just close this off saying, so Staccato is an enterprise-hardened platform as a service. And it's extremely easy to use. But the reason I'm here is because Staccato, which is a Cloud Foundry Paas based on Cloud Foundry, it incorporates Docker. And it's actually the first commercial product that came out that actually incorporated Docker. It's because of that PyCon back in 2013 when we recognized the power of it. It's the first commercial product, I should say, besides .cloud, who wrote it in the first place. So very simple to use it. It's just a two-step process. Basically, download it and boot it, and you've got it. Now, I have a lot more things I could talk about the history of how containerization worked at ActiveState with Paas. We have a lot of expertise. I don't have enough time. I'm down to about 30 seconds. But I will say that we have seen a lot of very powerful benefits from using Docker and containerization. We use containers before Docker, for sure. We have a very extensive containerization system. But Docker really helped the whole thing out, and we're extremely pleased with it. Lots of benefits. So the last thing I'll say is the next phase of this hype cycle thing, there's this trough that we're kind of in, maybe, and maybe not. But then after that, we have this slope of enlightenment, and then after this, the platform of productivity. So I'll just say, seeing the enthusiasm and the energy here, it's clear we're well on our way to the slope of enlightenment. So welcome, and thanks for your time.